Okay, welcome and good evening. Please forgive the delay. We have a professor, Professor Ladd's bringing his class here, so I wanted to give them a couple minutes to get over here. Before we start, let me remind you please to silence your phone or other devices, please. I'm Glenn Moots, professor here at Northwood and director of Northwood University's Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise. And very happy to see all of you here tonight. Tonight is our Constitution Day lecture, the first in our series of semester programming, and our theme this semester is Capitalism Moral? And if you'd like to know more about our semester's programs, let me know. And also you can send me an email, and I'll add you to a list that I send out an email to folks to let them know what's coming up. On October 11th, we'll have a panel in here at 4:30 on Adam Smith and the origins of capitalism. We have two rising young scholars of economics who will be here to discuss Adam Smith, and Professor Matchek, who's here tonight, will be leading that panel. On October 24th at 7 p.m. in here, Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute will be speaking on the sharing economy. Now, you may also know it as the gig economy, and if those two things don't ring a bell, just think of Uber. So Jared's going to come on the 24th and tell us all whether we'll all be doing Uber jobs, Uber-ish jobs someday. So those of you that are going into the workforce, as opposed to those of us that are halfway through it, you might want to come out and find out about that. Jared is one of the leading voices on this, so he's someone well worth hearing. Now, we have two debates in November. And debates always draw a crowd, so I encourage you to keep your schedule clear and keep your eyes peeled. November 1st, Jim Johnson, whom some of you know, may have had as a professor. He also debated Professor Tokarev here in the spring on the subject of sweatshops. Jim will be debating Vinnie Vernuccio from the Mackinac Center, which is right downtown, on the question of right to work. Now, may not know what right to work is, but it essentially concerns whether workers should or should not be compelled to join a union. And Jim and Vinnie will be debating that and the status of right to work here in Michigan. Our last event, unfortunately, have not yet firmed up, but it'll be mid-November, and that will be our big debate on whether capitalism is moral. Doug Bondow will be here. Some of you may remember Doug. He was here a couple of years ago to debate on foreign policy. I have an opponent for Doug, but he hasn't yet confirmed, but that'll be the 14th or 15th. Now, for all our semester programs, including tonight, we owe tremendous thanks to our co-sponsors, the Institute for Humane Studies, together with the John Templeton Foundation. And they've been our partners throughout the semester and previous semesters, and as I said, for tonight as well. The Institute for Humane Studies was founded in 1961. It's located in Arlington, Virginia, and advances a freer society by facilitating the development of students and scholars who share an interest in liberty. Now, IHS has a lot of great programs for undergraduates. So if you want to deepen your studies as they pertain to economics or politics and the study of liberty, let me know. I'm sure Professor Matchek or others would be happy to help direct you to those programs. They're usually free. They may even come with a small stipend, and they're a great opportunity. Now, IHS partners with the John Templeton Foundation for programs like this, and the Templeton Foundation serves as a philanthropic catalyst for discoveries relating to big questions of human purpose and ultimate reality, and we thank the Templeton Foundation as well. Now, students, IHS wants your feedback. So when you came in, you saw a couple of students in the back giving you a survey. We'd love for you to fill that survey out. If you're a student of mine, I really need you to fill that out. You can leave those in the basket in the back. You can give them to those students. And also, when you turn that survey in at the back, we have free copies of the Constitution. So you can take that with you and pretend you're at a national political convention and wave it around at people. And they'll be impressed that you have a copy of the Constitution. So please fill that survey out at the conclusion and drop that in the basket. Now tonight we celebrate the signing of the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. It was signed by 39 delegates, submitted to the Congress of the Confederation for a long process of revision and ratification. And this remarkable document was the product of immense theory and practice of government in America, together with precedents in Britain and Europe, and extending back to the Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews. And the Constitution has certainly has not been without its detractors then and now, and has withstood wave upon wave of criticism and revision. The Constitution remains unique in many aspects among the civil charters of the world, and its ideals, if not always its current practice, remain the envy of many. But our Constitution's effectiveness presumes a citizenry that knows and cares about it, and sadly, that is not always the case today. So whatever you may think about Donald Trump's big, beautiful wall, as he described it, the fact of the matter is that citizens who don't understand the starting point of their nation are barely citizens at all. We take pride in being citizens on this side of the wall, but do we really take the duties of citizenship seriously? And whatever you may think about spoiled NFL players taking a knee during the anthem, our almost systematic neglect of America's founding documents is perhaps equally disrespectful. Most Americans could not pass the U.S. Immigration Service's citizenship exam, nor could they articulate rights protected in the Bill of Rights, though many think that the Constitution gives them a right to drive a car and own a pet. In short, it's always a good time to learn about the Constitution. And tonight we have Professor Anthony Peacock to help us. Professor Peacock is professor and department head in the Political Science Department at Utah State University. He's also co-director of the university's Center for the Study of American Constitutionalism. Professor Peacock is the author or editor of numerous books, including How to Read the Federalist Papers, Freedom and the Rule of Law, Deconstructing the Republic, Affirmative Action and Representation, and Rethinking the Constitution, in addition to numerous articles, book chapters, and book reviews on American law and politics. Tony has provided media commentary on state and local politics and has lectured on American politics and law both nationally and internationally, and he even gets as far away from Utah to come to Michigan, which he says reminds him a bit of home, not Utah. He currently sits on the advisory board of the Coalition of Freedom and the National Constitution Center, which is in Philadelphia. Some of you may have been there. And also he is on the Utah State Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. At Utah State, he teaches courses on fields of constitutional law, constitutional theory, law and policy, law and politics, and war, and political theory, and he comes highly recommended to us as a scholar and a professor. Tony's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A, and I'll have a microphone for that purpose. So if you have a question, if you can use a microphone, that's great, because we are recording this, and that way your question is on that recording. And after that, we'll have a reception in the lobby, in the lecture hall here upstairs. I hope you'll join us for that in celebration of our Constitution's birthday. There will be cake, and the singing is entirely up to you. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Peacock.
All right, well, can you all hear me? Is the mic working? I got hooked up here. I'm not technologically very competent, so I had to get some help turning this on. I told whoever hooked me up that I had a loud and obnoxious voice, so it probably wouldn't matter whether it worked or not. And if I speak too loudly, hopefully they can turn it down. Anyway, I would like to thank Professor Moots as well as IHS and the Templeton Foundation for inviting me here today, and everybody else at Northwood who have made this talk possible. When my kids asked me where I was going, I told them I'm going 2 hours north of Hockeytown. We're big hockey fans in our family. All my kids play hockey. I coach them. and they were excited to know that I was heading someplace north of Detroit. I'm happy to say that I arrived last night about 5 o'clock and checked into the hotel here, drove down to, I think is it Diamond Jim's? Is there a place downtown called Diamond Jim's? First place I walked across the street to and poked my head into, and there on the big screen TV, they had the World Cup of Hockey, Team USA playing Team Finland, so I didn't bother going anywhere else. I'd been in Midland less than 3 hours, and I'd already achieved nirvana as far as I was concerned, and thankfully Team USA won. I hope, is anybody here from Finland? Okay, good. I figure I'll offend somebody over the course of the talk, but I don't want to start too early. Team USA won 3-2, so I felt right at home here. In any event, I'm very happy to be here. The title to the talk today is The Constitution and the Spirit of Enterprise. And you guys, I suspect, spent a lot of time talking about the idea of enterprise, and I'm going to say something about that today. And what I want to do is relate the concept of the spirit of enterprise to the Constitution, which 229 years ago, from I think it's this Saturday, was signed in Philadelphia, and then the 39 delegates that signed it, there were 55 delegates in Philadelphia, 39, as Professor Moots pointed out, signed it, and they all went their separate ways to secure ratification of it. So I'm going to talk about the spirit of enterprise, old and new. I want to talk about the old version of the spirit of enterprise in the Federalist Papers. Those were the 85 papers that were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in the fall of 1787 and the spring of 1788. Hamilton wrote 51 of the papers, Madison wrote 26, John Jay wrote 5, and Madison and Hamilton jointly wrote 3. And they're considered to be probably the third leading document. If you look at the pantheon of American political or constitutional documents, you've got the Declaration of Independence at the top, the Constitution, and then most people like Clinton Rossiter, Harry Jaffa, others, would rank the Federalist Papers, or the Federalist as it's called, third in that order because it is arguably the most comprehensive and cogent defense of the original articles to the Constitution ever written. So I will say something about what the Federalist understands by the spirit of enterprise, and this is sort of the egghead theory component of the talk. And then I will talk about the modern regulatory state, the spirit of enterprise in the modern era. And I'll also say something about the Supreme Court's Commerce Clause jurisprudence, which is an important field of law that relates to the development of the spirit of enterprise because it regulates the extent to which the federal government can and cannot regulate commerce at the federal level. And there's been a lot of controversy over the Commerce Clause issues and things like the Obamacare litigation, the National Federation of Independent Business case from 2012, the Burrell case from a couple of years ago that I'll mention at the end of the talk. And then I'll open the floor up to questions. I'll speak till about 10 to 7 o'clock or so, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. And hopefully there'll be enough covered that you'll all have questions for me at the end of the day. So I thought I'd begin with an opening question. Why do we even care about the Founders' Constitution? They drafted this Constitution 229 years ago. Why should we care what the Founders had to say about the Constitution or the question of the spirit of enterprise? That's a perfectly fair question. And I think the answer is that the American people are largely fed up with the federal government. They're fed up with what it does. They're fed up with federal politicians. I think that's reflected in today's politics on both the left and the right. And they want answers. And where do you get answers? Well, you get it by looking at the American founders. Robert Bork, who was President Reagan's nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1987, he didn't get there. He got borked, as they say, in the U.S. Senate. His name became a verb because it wasn't confirmed by the Senate. But he wrote a very famous book called The Tempting of America that became a bestseller in 1990. And he discussed the importance of understanding the founders in what's called originalist jurisprudence. And I think that he and Ed Meese, President Reagan's Attorney General, did more to resurrect interest in the Founders' Constitution than arguably any two other people over the last generation. and it's been a hot topic of conversation. I think the Tea Party resurrected that interest in 2010, and ever since, the Founders' Constitution has been an important subject of discussion. What Rich Lowry called, in an article a couple of years ago, the Lois Lerner state. Lois Lerner was the director of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division, who acknowledged at a meeting of the American Bar Association that she and her division had discriminated against conservative political action committee applications that had applied for 501c3 and 501c4 status. She acknowledged that they had discriminated against these groups. It was a very controversial issue. Some of you may recall the issue a couple of years ago. That sort of state, that sort of bureaucratic unaccountability, I think annoys Americans. And I think for that reason, the Constitution has become front and center in a lot of the political debates recently. Now, what exactly is the Founders' Constitution? Let me just give a brief definition of what I think it is and what I think the Federalist Papers would say it is. And that is, it's a government of limited constitutional ends. We often refer to American constitutional government as limited government constitutionalism. And this derives from the Declaration of Independence. Right? The Declaration of Independence is key affirmation that all men are created equal and they have inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the ends of government, as the Declaration sets it out, is simply to protect those rights. That's a very limited definition of politics. If you study philosophy, ancient philosophy, you read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, they have a much more capacious definition of what politics should control. We don't have that in this country. The government, the federal government in particular, is very limited in terms of the sort of things that we think it should do. In Federalist 23, written by Alexander Hamilton, this is what Hamilton listed as the four principal purposes of the new constitutional union. I'm going to quote here from Federalist 23. First purpose, the common defense of the members. That's the first purpose of government. Second purpose, the preservation of the public peace as well against internal convulsions as external attacks. Number three, the regulation of commerce with other nations and between the states. And number four, the superintendence of America's intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries. That's basically the treaty-making power. That's it. There's no regulation of insurance markets, no regulation of education or labor. Under the original Constitution, those were considered to be traditional state powers, police powers of the states, not the federal government. That's no longer the case today. So our Constitution today, as interpreted by the courts and other branches of government, is a very different political animal or constitutional animal than what the founders understood it to be. And the question is, well, how do we get there? Or how do we get here to what it is today? So what exactly, beyond these four ends of the Constitution, was the Constitution supposed to achieve? And this is where things get interesting. I don't know if many of you have actually read the Federalist Papers or studied them in any classes. You may have taken them in a basic American government class. But I teach the Federalist Papers on a regular basis. In my constitutional theory class or in constitutional law, I always refer to them. And one of my favorite things to do is to have students read over Federalist 10. And shortly after you get into Federalist 10 is well known. It's Madison's arguably most succinct formulation of the purpose of American government and what the Constitution is going to do. It's going to remedy the problem, the disease of majority faction. But he actually goes into significant detail about what the objects of government are. All right, and here, let me just read to you what Madison writes in Federalist 10 is the first object of government. And this is what he says. The first object of government is the protection of the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate. All right, I'll repeat that. The protection of the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate. All right, now this was very different from John Locke's definition of government. If you study political philosophy, you know that John Locke, the famous British philosopher, who arguably influenced the Declaration more than any other British philosopher, Thomas Jefferson, cites at length from Locke's Second Treatise of Government. And Locke defined the purpose of government as the protection of property. He had a very broad definition of property, but it was the protection of property. But Madison sets it out in very different terms. It's actually the protection of the diverse faculties from which the rights of property originate. The rights of property are just a subset of the protection of the diverse faculties. Now, what the heck does this mean? Was Madison off his rocker momentarily when he wrote this? Answer, no. Right, it's a very interesting definition. Right, this is a lecture on the spirit of enterprise. Right, we often refer to America as the land of opportunity. Right, you're all taking an undergraduate degree here to better yourself, to make yourself better than you are. Hopefully to learn a few things along the way, maybe to get a job when you get out. But Madison's definition is that we're going to have a constitution that is going to allow you to pursue the things that you want to pursue and to develop yourself in such a way that no other political regime has ever afforded. Right? You're going to be able to cultivate your faculties in a way that no other political regime has ever allowed. And this is where the spirit of enterprise becomes so critical. All right, the spirit of enterprise is going to be the vehicle through which Americans are going to be allowed to pursue these new opportunities that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay talk about at length in the Federalist Papers. Now, let me just say something about the Federalist itself. And again, I know many of you have taken American government classes. And one of the orthodox interpretations of the Federalist is that the Federalist is really about political institutions, separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, an independent executive, an independent judiciary. And that's true. The Federalist, especially the second half of the Federalist, numbers 37 through 85, largely talk about the institutions of government. They talk. Federalist 52, Federalist 58 talks about the Congress. Subsequent numbers talk about the Senate and the executive. A lot of discussion of that in the Federalist. But I would argue that the most important part of the Federalist teaching is really its non-institutional teaching. It has nothing really to do directly with the institutions of government. The institutions of government are just a means to ends. And the question is, what are those ends? And the Federalist sets out two basic ends that the Constitution has to meet. It has to protect private rights, which makes sense because the Declaration talks about the Constitution having to protect rights. And it also has to protect the general welfare. And this is more of the equality principle from the Declaration. And the general welfare will be what enhances the protection of rights. And so the question beyond that is, well, how are you going to protect rights? How are you going to facilitate the general welfare? And Federalist numbers 7 and 11 suggest that that's going to be enhanced through unleashing this spirit of enterprise. Now, how exactly that's going to take place is an interesting question. But one of the important things to recognize about the Federalist discussion is that there's actually a spirit to enterprise. The very concept of spirit of enterprise first makes its way into the American lexicon in the Federalist. Federalist 7 and Federalist 11, both written by Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton had thought deeply about this. The concept of enterprise was a very new concept in 1787. We talk about it regularly here. Enterprise is one of the missions of this university. It's very much a part of the American lexicon here now. But it wasn't in 1787. So what exactly did they mean by the spirit of enterprise? I worked for a couple hours this morning at the hotel, and then I decided to go out for a walk. And I discovered there's a rail trail here. I didn't know about the rail trail. I just happened upon it, so I started walking. I think it's east of here, past the river. And I walked all the way down to the Dow plant. I guess it's a medical center and some sort of an industrial plant down towards the end of the trail. And there's a little memorial to Herbert Dow there, if any of you have been down there. And the first thing the memorial says is Herbert Dow was a creator. And he sought innovation and entrepreneurship in his workers. And he tried to imbue that spirit in his workers. All right, and that's the language that was used, a spirit. All right? The idea of enterprise isn't just a material concept. Right? It speaks to a large extent to America's constitutional soul, the character that Americans will assume over time. They're going to be enterprising individuals. They're going to have freedom like no one's ever had before. They're going to have freedom to pursue the things that they want to do like never before. And this is what the Federalist means. This is arguably, I think, the most important teaching that the Federalist gives us, although you don't read it in too much of the literature on the Federalist, unfortunately. But this is a key concept in the Federalist. Now, let me just go through some of the other, if you want to call it, heterodoxies of the Federalist before I move on to talking about the regulatory state and the Supreme Court. Now, again, if you study the history of political theory, you know that there were philosophers like Adam Smith. I sort of joke when I teach political economy classes. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, it was published the same year the Declaration was signed. Published The Wealth of Nations. It's often, I refer to it as the Old Testament in defense of capitalism. All right, the New Testament, I think, is Frederick Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, published in 1960. And I'll say something about Hayek in a minute here. Now, Adam Smith wrote extensively about commerce. So did David Hume, another member of the Scottish Enlightenment. So did John Locke. So did the famous French philosopher Montesquieu, who wrote about the spirit of the laws. And Montesquieu's big, thick spirit of the laws was more interested in the spirit of the laws rather than the letter of the law. What kind of constitutional and political regimes generated what kind of citizen character? And the focus was on the spirit. He looked at the principles of political institutions and how those shaped the various political types that dominating these regimes. Now, the Federalist accepts much of what this classical liberal theory says about commerce. All right, that it's going to generate moderation. It's going to promote toleration, peace, wealth, freedom. The Federalist agrees with all of that, but with one important qualification. You can only get that with the right kind of constitutional regime. If you don't have that constitutional regime, if the United States were to divide, say, into 13 separate states or 2 or 3 confederacies, they would be at each other's throats. And they would be at each other's throats in very short order because commercial republics, republics devoted to commerce, contrary to what people like Montesquieu said, were not moderate or pacific in character. They were actually very spirited, enterprising, and warlike. Right? And there's some very interesting language in the Federalist. You never hear this about the Federalist Papers. But I think Hamilton and Madison both rejected one of these fundamental orthodoxies about the nature of commercial society. And this is an interesting observation because I think it speaks not only to the nature of American enterprise, but I think that enterprising character is the reason why we have such an effective military instrument. And the Federalist talks about this too. We have the most powerful military in the world, the most effective military in the world, the most principled military in the world. Why? It wasn't just a fluke. It's very closely related to the same concept of enterprise, innovation, spiritedness, devotion to principle, and carrying out these principles through this enterprising culture. Right? And this is all right there in the Federalist, if people read it closely. So let me just quote a few passages from the early Federalists where Hamilton in particular, but also James Madison, make a turn away from this classical liberal orthodoxy about the pacifism of commercial republics. All right, this is what John Jay writes in Federalist 5. He warned about how disunion might cause the more industrial northern hive, and that's the metaphor that Jay uses, northern hive, to threaten the South. That the hives, and again I'm quoting directly from Federalist 5, young swarms might often be tempted to gather honey in the more blooming fields and milder air of their luxurious and more delicate neighbors. All right, that's from Federalist 5. Now Federalist 6. Federalist 6 similarly admonished that commercial republics dating back to those of ancient Athens and Carthage had been warlike. That included the American variants whose impatience and potential willingness to go to war over the undue restrictions of the Articles of Confederation, as well as on other political grounds, are documented at length in the Federalist. The modern empires of the day, Spain, France, and especially Great Britain, were also the most commercially dynamic. And yet they were the most martial and the most warlike. In fact, Federalist 11 goes so far as to say we need a powerful federal navy to ward off these commercial empires. We need to create, as Carl Walling has put it, a republican empire in order to fight the imperial empires of the day, all of which were commercial. And then finally, in Federalist 7, Hamilton writes that the spirit of enterprise, which characterizes the commercial part of America, would, quote, not pay much respect to those regulations of trade by which particular states might endeavor to secure exclusive benefits to their own citizens. Infractions of these regulations on one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other, would naturally lead to outrages, and these to reprisals and wars. And this was the Tea Party of 1787. Right? You couldn't get anything more explicit in Federalist 7 than what Hamilton sets out there. Right? The spirit of enterprise, which is the source of so much betterment, is so emphatic and so ticked off. In this case, it's state regulations. Not federal regulations, but the attempts by states to create regulations to benefit their own states to the discrimination of citizens of other states. Those were so offensive that the country might go to war over this in a divided America. And one of the key things that the Constitution had to do is it had to temper this very animated spirit of enterprise that had really taken a hold in the U.S. and direct it toward more salutary ends, like the betterment of mankind, the sort of peace that the globalization theorists talk about today. Right? The globalization theorists are always talking about how greater commerce, greater interaction between commercial nations will result in more peace, more wealth. And there's a certain truth to that. But there's a certain falsehood to it as well. Have we actually ended up with more of that? As China has become much more wealthy commercially, has it become much more pacific towards us and others? What about other nations that have developed commercially? Does that happen? Right, this is a very interesting question that Hamilton raises explicitly in 1787 in Federalist 7. And we're still largely struggling with the same question today. And this is why the Constitution is so important as a means of promoting union, and why the union itself is so critical to maintain. If you have this massive economic engine working together, it can generate an unparalleled wealth and prosperity and opportunity for everyone. Divide it up into 3 or 4 or 5 confederacies, and we're going to have a lot of problems. This is what the early Federalist numbers had to say. Okay, so I'll just say a couple more remarks about the Federalist, then I want to move on. So the key reason why the Constitution should be embraced over the old Articles of Confederation has to do with this idea of freeing up the instruments of commerce. As Federalist 12 famously put it, a prosperous commerce would vivify and invigorate all the channels of industry. Accordingly, the Federalists saw the energy from this enterprise and activity bleeding over into the liberal, philosophical, and even the martial arts. The key here was to understand that both the physically laboring faculties as well as the intellectual faculties remain largely undeveloped absent extensive commercial development and enterprise, which were crucial to providing the means through which these otherwise idle instruments got activated, refined, and enlarged. All right, this is sort of the observation of the English Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. People are naturally lethargic. Right? They're not naturally active. You have to get them active through commerce. And if you do that, if through the generation of commerce, you end up providing people all sorts of opportunities to exercise their faculties, to get out and do things, you're going to end up with a very dynamic society of pretty happy people. Because there are all sorts of opportunities you're going to have to do things that you would never have otherwise. Where would you prefer to live? The United States or Somalia? I think most people would prefer to live in the United States. We have an immigration problem on the southern border. I think everybody agrees that there's an issue there. But it's not with Americans going south. All right? It's with people coming north. And why do those people want to come here? I think the answer again is pretty obvious. Right? Hume, Hamilton, and Madison, they get things right. Right? They want to come to the land of opportunity. But you've got to create that opportunity through commerce. Right? You've got to activate things. You've got to keep people from remaining idle by providing them opportunities. And if you get in the way of those opportunities, as Hamilton suggests in Federalist 7, the country could end up going to war over these issues. Look at the Tea Party movement. Look at the Trump movement today. People are fed up to a large extent with the federal government, and they're angry. And things weren't any different in 1787. Right? This is a very important message from the Federalist. And it wasn't just, again, about commercial enterprise. It was very much about creating an effective military. Because that was the other reason. There were two basic reasons for the Constitutional Convention, which Hamilton argued for, probably more than any other American founder. He was the one at Annapolis that arranged for the Philadelphia Convention. He was the most strident advocate for the need for a Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And the two reasons were commerce and national security. And they were intimately related. And if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which sets out Congress's powers, the first half are roughly powers related to economics or commerce, including the Commerce Clause that I'll have something to say about in a second. And the last 7 powers or so are all devoted to war, giving Congress the power over war. Right? And these two things go together very intimately. Okay. Moral of the story here. A lot of you, if you take American government classes, you'll read about Hamilton's famous advocacy for the need for more energetic government. Right? My point here is that that government itself is predicated upon the social energy that's generated in the civic, private world through the cultivation of enterprise. And that was the most important thing that the Constitution had to facilitate, this world of free enterprise, which isn't just, again, materialistic. It applies to any kind of opportunity you might want to pursue. All right? If you don't have that world of enterprise, it doesn't matter what kind of political regime you have, and you don't have the wealth or the civil wherewithal to actually finance your so-called energetic government. And this is frequently overlooked in how the Federalist Papers and other founding literature is taught on the Constitution. Okay, now let me, just one final quote. Actually, this is from Arthur Brooks, who's the president of the American Enterprise Institute. He's written some good literature on this, and as President Brooks, we had President Brooks out to Utah State a couple years ago to speak to our students, gave a very good talk. And one of the principal themes of everything that he's written on American political economy and on American enterprise is that the American Enterprise Initiative was initially a moral enterprise. It wasn't an economic enterprise. There was a moral order that the world of enterprise was intended to vindicate or unleash. Right? And that's the important moral here. So if you take one lesson away from this lecture, it's that the Constitution, 1787, was supposed to be a constitution of enterprise. All right? Okay, now, that's sort of the egghead theory component of the lecture. Let me say something in the last 15 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes or so, about some more practical stuff. The question was, okay, if you want to free up the American economic order, right, the Articles of Confederation, which we had right after the Revolution, had led to sort of economic sclerosis. Right? There are all sorts of economic problems in the 1780s that the Articles themselves have created. James Madison wrote his famous Vices of Government in 1786, pointing a lot of the problems out. All right, so the question was, how is the Constitution going to unclog the economic arteries? How is it going to overcome this problem of economic sclerosis? And there are a lot of different answers to that, but the one I'm going to focus on here is the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's the third subparagraph in the article. Right? And what the Commerce Clause did is it gave the federal government the power to regulate what the egghead constitutional lawyers like me refer to as interstate commerce, or as Article 1, Section 8 phrases it, its actual language is commerce among the states. And then the other important power it gave to the federal government was the power to regulate commerce with other countries. All right? That's the Commerce Clause. That's basically the most important thing that it does. And I would say that the Commerce Clause worked relatively well through most of the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. And then things became more problematic in the 20th century. And what happened in the 20th century was the emergence of two things. One, the regulatory state, and two, the idea of the planned economy. And that was what came out of the progressive era. The progressive era began in the early part of the 20th century. You could say the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, and has continued to this day. And it gave rise to the idea of the planned economy. Now, I mentioned Frederick Hayek. Anybody here read any of Hayek's works? Anybody in the room read The Constitution of Liberty or any of Frederick Hayek's other works? Frederick Hayek was a very famous Austrian economist. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1973. He is considered to be, in many respects, the father of modern free market or capitalist economics. And he wrote a very good book called The Constitution of Liberty, which I actually use in a class that I'm teaching this semester, my law and policy class. We look at Hayek, who's the great defender of capitalism. Then I'm going to have the students look at Cass Sunstein, who I think is probably the consummate defender of the modern regulatory state. He was Barack Obama's regulation czar a couple of years ago, and I think he understands the capitalist argument. So I pit these two against each other. It's like having a debate in class through these texts on free market economics and the regulatory state. Now, I'm just going to focus on Hayek here. And what Hayek had to say about the regulatory state was very interesting, because his point was that capitalist economies were not only better than planned economies or socialist economies because they generated more wealth, but they were especially better because they used knowledge better than planned economies. All right, people who run diamond gyms down in downtown Midland or running a business here in Midland know a lot better what to do with their businesses than some regulator or bureaucrat in Washington knows about how to run their business, because they have the knowledge necessary to know what's needed to improve things. Right? That's Hayek's basic point. It's a practical knowledge point. And this is the fundamental problem with the modern regulatory state. It actually doesn't use knowledge anywhere near as efficiently as the capitalist system does, where people are left free to do things on their own. And I get into more detail about that, but I want to try to finish up here the next 5-10 minutes or so. So I want to say something about the court. Many think today that the federal government is the greatest threat to free enterprise because it impedes Americans at every stage of economic life, creating unnecessary costs and paperwork, delaying decisions for years, taking a one-size-fits-all approach to problems that can generally be resolved much more efficiently at the local level, and perhaps most importantly, because regulators rather than legislators tend to make laws in the modern regulatory state. And there are lots of examples of that. In other words, there's no democratic accountability. Try calling any federal department in Washington with a problem. Try doing that. Try calling the EPA. I give a lot of lectures in Utah to what are called 912 groups. And these are often staffed. There are lots of small business people that come to these lectures. A lot of ranchers. We have a lot of ranchers in Utah. 70% of the land in Utah is owned by the federal government. I can't tell you how many ranchers I've come to, ticked right off, because they want to do something on their ranch, and they have to contact the BLM or the Bureau of Land Management or the EPA to get the go-ahead to do something on their ranch because they have to comply with some sort of federal regulation, and it takes years, sometimes even decades, to get a response. And they can't do anything, and they're the ones paying the cost of the delay, obviously not the federal bureaucracy. An example near and dear to many Utahns, but I could multiply the examples here many times over. Now, Professor Moots mentioned Doug Bandow of the Cato Institute. And Doug has pointed out that the regulatory state, both he and Clyde Wayne Cruz, some of you may know from the competitive enterprise, have pointed out that the modern administrative state is essentially lawless. All right, as Cruz has pointed out in a very interesting essay called The Tip of the Cosberg, economic regulation, environmental controls, tax compliance, and other bureaucratic regulations have cost the American economy as of 2015 almost $1.9 trillion annually. Right, this is what he estimates. That's a ton of dough. This is what the modern regulatory state costs the American taxpayer and the American citizen. Bandow asks, when benefits are provided and penalties exacted without lawmakers' approval, which is what the regulatory state entails, do we still live in a democratic system based on the rule of law? And Bandow says, no. We live effectively in a system of administrative tyranny. Now, whether you agree with that or not, maybe that's a bit of an overstatement. But he's on to something. And if you've dealt with administrators in Washington, you know that he's on to something. And I would suggest that that's a problem for the spirit of enterprise these days. An interference in the ability of people to carry out what they want to do from the point of view of enterprise. Now, the last institution I want to talk to you about is the Supreme Court. Because I think a lot of people, like Bandow and Cruz, talk about the administrative state, that branch of the executive that is a problem. Some people talk of Congress, some people talk of the executive. I'm a constitutional law geek, so I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court. And I just want to say a couple things about the Supreme Court's Commerce Clause jurisprudence, because I know that you can't take constitutional law here. I talked to Professor Moots about this. I was curious to know if students here could take constitutional law. I understand that you can't. In the department I'm in, I'm department head in political science at Utah State. We're a big research university, about 27,000 students or so. We have lots of programs, and we have 3 majors in our department, one of which is a law and constitutional studies major. And if you take that major, you take constitutional law. So the students have a fair familiarity with the case law that the Supreme Court has generated in its interpretation of the Constitution. And one of the things that's fun to teach is the Commerce Clause jurisprudence, because it's an absolute dog's breakfast. A mishmash of different decisions that go all over the place. And if you study law, this is one of the things that makes lawyers rich, is that incoherent law means you're going to do a lot of litigation, and litigation makes lawyers rich. And there's been a lot of litigation over the meaning of the Commerce Clause over particularly the last 80 or 90 years or so. And there are basically 2 interpretations of the Commerce Clause. I'm going to try to tie things up here shortly, so I won't go into too much detail. But in what's called the NFIB case, the National Federation of Independent Business case, this is the original Obamacare decision from 2012 over what was called the individual mandate, whether the government could mandate everybody to pay insurance. All right, and the important part of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, is that it was young people like you that they wanted to mandate paying insurance so that you could pay for the medical care for old geezers like me. All right, this is the predicate of the legislation. That everybody had to pay in, but the assumption was that you guys are healthy and wouldn't have to generate too many costs on the medical system. And by paying a premium, this mandate, you would be able to finance medical care for old geezers like me who tend to get sick more often. All right, and this was challenged in the NFIB case. And there was a very good decision at the federal district court level in Florida by a judge by the name of Roger Vinson. And Vinson went through all this case law. It's a long decision, but it's a very educational decision. If you want to read one decision in which the basic Commerce Clause jurisprudence of the last 100 years is summarized, that's the decision to read. And he said there are basically 2 strains of jurisprudence. There's the original or founder's version, and then there's the newer, broader, progressive version of Commerce Clause jurisprudence. And the founder's version, he went through essays by Robert Bork, Randy Barnett, and others, who had looked at what the founders thought the Commerce Clause meant, and it basically meant trade. All right? That's all it meant. It didn't mean, and this is from a 1942 decision, the progressive meaning of the Commerce Clause, and that was, and this is from a case called Wickard versus Filburn, those activities that substantially affect interstate commerce. All right, that's the definition that we have today. And the court's gone back and forth. Well, that's too broad. No, it's not. All right, if the Commerce Clause simply means all you can regulate is trade, not anything that has a significant effect on the economic world, that's the very definition of what the federal government can regulate. That's what Clarence Thomas would like to do. He'd like to go back to the old definition of the Commerce Clause, because once you do that, there are all sorts of restrictions that would apply to the federal government that would rein in the size of the federal government. All right, there have been a whole host of federal laws that have been struck down because the court, beginning in the 1990s, started to go back to this narrow construction, with Thomas and Scalia leading the way, on gun-free school zones, on the Violence Against Women's Act. All right, the court said, look, these things have nothing to do with commerce. They're fundamentally criminal law regulations. You can't regulate these things nationally under the pretense that this has to do with commerce. It just doesn't have to do with that. All right, so this is one of the great disputes of the 21st century, and this is why the court composition is so important, because all of these decisions are 5-4 splits. Right now we've got a 4-4 conservative-liberal split, with Justice Kennedy being a bit of a switch hitter. Sometimes he's conservative, sometimes he's liberal. But this is very much what's at stake. So let me just conclude with 4 points that I think constitute the most significant threats to the spirit of enterprise in the modern era. The first has to do with the broad construction of the Commerce Clause, because this is, and I'm simplifying here to some extent, but not too much, this broad construction has really been the vehicle through which the federal government has been able to regulate all sorts of things that it couldn't regulate before. Right? The Obamacare case is a great example. President Obama's lawyers argued in the NFIB case, the original Obamacare case, we're demanding that you pay this mandate on the basis of the Commerce Clause because it affects interstate commerce. And Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the opinion that many thought was a bizarre opinion because all the lawyers argued that about the Commerce Clause, he said, well, it can't be about commerce because you're forcing somebody to engage in commercial activity that has never engaged in commercial activity before. We can't give the federal government that power. So I'm going to call it a tax. Nobody had argued that it was a tax in the case. And this was Roberts' own doing. He came up, well, it's a tax, so I'm going to allow it. You can't regulate it under the Commerce Clause, but you can regulate it as a tax. All right, and this was a bizarre decision that had its own implications, but these are the sorts of disputes in which the modern regulatory state hangs in the balance. So that's the first issue. The second issue is the modern administrative state more generally. As John Yoo, who's a law professor at the University of California at Berkeley, used to work in President Bush Jr.'s Office of Legal Counsel. As he's put it, the underlying theme of the Obama administration has been the growth of the administrative state, and this has 4 distinct features. First, expand federal powers beyond their enumerated constitutional limits. Second, delegate those powers to agencies and away from elected politicians in Congress. Third, insulate civil servants from politics so that they can wield their discretion without accountability. This may be the most dangerous aspect of the modern administrative state. 4, force courts to defer unthinkingly to Congress's acts of delegation and agency regulation. And this is often referred to as the Chevron deference principle. Just defer to them. Don't scrutinize what they're doing. And this is going to become an important dispute before the Supreme Court because this is a case that may well end up challenged if people like, again, Clarence Thomas get their way sometime in the future. Now, the third thing, I just want to throw this in because this has a lot to do with the modern regulatory state. And I've written on this, as Professor Moots pointed out. I wrote a book and edited another book on the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is a good example of the modern regulatory state gone awry. Now, we usually don't think of issues dealing with race issues as having anything to do with enterprise, but it has a lot to do with enterprise. Because one of the arguments made in the Federalist, and Federalist 17 in particular, is that the new commercial union would unite us all on the basis of commerce. And the idea was that through commercial interaction we become one citizenry. No longer divided by race, hopefully, or ethnicity, or religion, or all of the chauvinisms related to that. And the example that they cite is the Act of Union in the UK from 1707, where the Scots joined the British Union. And one of the arguments made by Queen Anne at the time was that this will actually overcome the clanship of Scotland if, in fact, the UK becomes a union. And the Federalists said the same thing could happen in America. And what I think has happened with the Voting Rights Act, it was arguably the best, most successful piece of civil rights legislation in American history when it was passed in 1965. Because it did more, I think, to fortify American republicanism by giving African Americans the right to vote in the South almost 100 years after ratification of the 15th Amendment for the first time. And it was a radical success. Southern politics changed forever, and so did American politics. But like so many other pieces of civil rights legislation, it got turned on its head. Rather than in Martin Luther King's terms, judging Americans by the content of their character, the Voting Rights Act of today, the Voting Rights Act of what's called second-generation voting rights, actually requires legislators and judges, including in Michigan, to count people by the color of their skin. Right, this is what the Voting Rights Act requires today in redistricting disputes across the nation, not only in the South, but across the nation where it applies. You have to allocate voters to electoral districts on the basis of their race or their ethnicity. Protected classes are African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asian Americans. And if you have sufficient concentrations of those, you have to create electoral districts to protect them. And this is often something that people don't really think about as having anything to do with enterprise or commerce. But I'm throwing that out as an example of, I think, a very divisive piece of legislation today that was arguably the best piece of legislation that did more to fortify American republicanism, and I think today does as much to divide Americans on the basis of race, because it forces purely partisan disputes between Democrats and Republicans to be transacted in the language of race. I've been involved in a number of these academic disputes and other things with this, and I throw this out as an example of how the modern regulatory state actually undermines the spirit of enterprise in a way that we often don't think about. And the final threat, and I'll end with this, that I think there is to free enterprise today is maybe the American electorate. All right, Federalist 55 famously emphasized that as much as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, this is the language from Federalist 55, Republican government relies on citizen virtue or those qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence more than any other regime. All right, this is what Professor Moots was alluding to earlier on. All right, we need a vigilant electorate. All right, maybe we had that in 2010. Maybe we had it in 2012. But if we don't like what we get in Washington, who do we have to blame? All right, there's obviously a frustration. I think this election exemplifies it more than any election in my lifetime. But the electorate is ultimately where the buck stops in terms of our problems. And so we need a vigilant electorate if we're going to save the spirit of enterprise, if we think it's under threat today. And that's, I think, ultimately where these sorts of problems with respect to maintaining freedom, maintaining a spirit of enterprise, ultimately are drawn. And that's why you people are important. All right? It's not old guys like me. It's people like you. Once you get out of here, you're going to be the power brokers in the country. You're going to go on, many of you, to very prominent positions. You're going to have a lot of influence. And these are the best days of your life because you get to contemplate things here when you're an undergrad. Maybe if you go on to grad school, you get to do it there too. That you'll never get to contemplate again when you get out into the working world. This is where you form your judgment, arguably the most emphatically. Life is an ongoing learning process, but this is a very important part of your adult education, arguably the most important part. So you guys are going to make the difference. Remember that. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Thank you very much again for having me here. Enjoyed it. So I think I'm supposed to take any questions people have. I think we're here till 7:30 or something, so we have a fair bit of time.
Okay, I've got a mic. So if you've got a question, I've got a mic.
So just raise your hand, and I'll come around.
Don't be shy.
Okay. Do me a favor, just hand this down. I'm going to turn this off, and then just turn it back.
Do you believe that we need a modern-day constitutional convention?
No. The simple answer is no. I know there are people like Mark Levin and others who argue that we need to have that. I think that would create more problems than we'd ever solve. There are certainly issues that people would like to see addressed through a convention, and he's probably the most prominent advocate on conservative talk radio for such an event to take place. But I think that it would, it would be almost impossible to get under the Constitution sufficient number of states and members of Congress to agree to that. But I think if you did do that, a lot of things that the advocates for such a convention don't want to have happen would actually happen. So the short answer is no. I don't think that's a good route to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Glenn, there's somebody down here.
You mentioned how closely divided the Supreme Court is, and it's curious, we've had quite a few Republican presidents, and in fact, even from 1980 to 1996, 16 consecutive years, and interrupted by the Clinton presidency, and then another 8 years. So how can, with all that time to nominate the kind of justices perhaps that you would like to see, they haven't been able to do it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And if there was, a simple answer to that, I'd probably be a rich man, or richer than I am. I'm not that rich, rest assured. But that's a very good question. And I think that I mentioned Robert Bork at the outset of the lecture. All right, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Robert Bork was Ronald Reagan's nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1987. He went through an extremely caustic Senate confirmation hearing in which he got voted down. All right, he got the 2 thumbs down from the Senate, a Democrat-controlled Senate. And it was, I think, the beginning of an education to the Republican Party about the importance of having a bench of potential judicial nominees. Because who was appointed to replace Bork? He's still on the court. Anybody know? Anthony Kennedy. And how much do Republicans like Anthony Kennedy? All right, thumbs down most of the time, or half the time, thumbs up perhaps. All right, he's all over the place as Republicans are concerned. And what happened as a result of Bork's nomination process was that Republicans became very cognizant of the need to sort of develop a judicial bench. And you ended up with, perhaps most importantly, the Federalist Society, which is a more conservative-oriented legal group that has branches at all sorts of law schools now in the country. And they have a large bench of potential judicial nominees who will be much better nominees as Republicans are concerned than John Paul Stevens or Anthony Kennedy or Sandra Day O'Connor. Stevens was a hardcore liberal for the most part across the board. O'Connor was seen by Republicans as a squish. We had Justice Scalia out to Utah State in 2008, and we all had a breakfast. We had a big conference with Justice Scalia, and he had some interesting things to say about life working with Sandra Day O'Connor. All right, these are people that drive, I think, the conservative members of the courts crazy. They drive Republicans crazy. And a lot of people were complaining about even Chief Justice Roberts. Or you had conservatives like Ann Coulter saying, look, George Bush just appointed Roberts because he doesn't have a paper trail. Right? He has little paper trail, so we can go ahead with him. And look at how he's turned out. Look at what he did in the Obamacare case. All right, 2 times. Not once, but twice. All right? So the Republicans have something to learn on this, although I think the nomination of Merrick Garland has shown that maybe they've learned a few things or two, not to simply rubber stamp Democrat appointees, although some speculate that if Hillary Clinton wins the election in November, he'll get confirmed in short order because they're afraid about who else she might nominate, which is to say they're afraid to have to fight a long-term battle over a potential nominee that might go on for 4 more years. And they're just going to capitulate. And if you're going to capitulate over Merrick Garland instead of some other more liberal nominee. There are Republicans who think that Garland is simply really a liberal in any event, and it won't matter whether it's him or somebody else, because on all the important cases he'll vote the way Ruth Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, the other 4 liberals on the court, vote. But that's a good question.
Steal a question.
Executive privilege, constitutionally speaking.
Prerogative.
Or prerogative, sure.
So you said earlier that commercial republics tend to be, I don't want to say militaristic, that's the wrong word, but they tend to have a strong military. That's fair, right?
Well, yeah. It's their character, all right. They're fundamentally restless, all right. And what I didn't talk about today, this is my own theory about the Federalists, and I didn't mean to interrupt mid-question. If you want to finish the question, go ahead.
No, I'll finish it based on whatever comes next.
Well, one of the things I didn't say is that, Hamilton and Madison are 2 of the best educated men who have ever drafted a constitution in any history. All right, they're both classically educated. They knew ancient Greek, they knew ancient Latin, or they knew Latin, they knew 4th and 5th century Attic. They had to pass exams that showed that they were completely familiar with the classics just to get in to King's College, which is now Columbia, that Hamilton went to, and the University of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University, where Madison went and completed his undergraduate degree in 2 years. Right? These guys were very well educated on the classics. And my own theory is that theme where you see Hamilton, I think Madison as well, reject people like Montesquieu and Adam Smith and David Hume, who all suggest that these commercial nations were really kind of pacific and more moderate in favor of much more Thucydidean. The famous Greek historian Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, the history between the ancient Athenians and the ancient Spartans. Right? They went to war between 431 BC and 404 BC. A 27-year-long war. Long war. And there's a famous oration, Pericles' funeral oration, where Pericles refers to commercial Athens as restless and dynamic. All right? And the Corinthians, the other commercial emporium of the day, they all go to Sparta. And they tell Sparta, those Athenians, they won't give anybody any rest. They're expanding like crazy. They've got all these commercial markets all over the place. They're the most aggressive people in all of Greece. You've got to do something about those guys. All right? And the Spartans start the war, according to Thucydides, to try to hold the Athenians back. All right? That's where I think Hamilton, in any event, gets his idea of the aggressive, militaristic commercial republic. They're not militaristic for the sake of being imperialists. They're just aggressive. They're expansionists. They acquire property. They acquire commerce. They want to expand markets. Right? And they're always on the go. All right? This isn't just Hume. This goes all the way back to Thucydides. And Federalist 6 explicitly refers to ancient Athens and ancient Carthage as republics of the commercial kind. Where do you get that, if not from Thucydides? And they say that they were engaged in war as often as the neighboring monarchies of the day. And in fact, Carthage started the war that ended in its annihilation. So that's where I think it comes from. And that's the idea. But you can temper it. That's the whole idea.
So I'm going to make you a rich man now if you can make this prediction for us. So I think about China, which I wouldn't call a commercial republic, but it's certainly more commercial, right? I mean, it's more vigorously
Certainly.
engaged in commerce and a kind of market activity. So then it should be restless, right? And so we see China projecting itself more militarily in East Asia. So on the one hand, we have 2 restless commercial powers, right, who are sort of jockeying for position worldwide and certainly in that part of the world. And at the same time, we have this argument that commerce and allows nations to be at peace and gives them a reason not to go to war. So how do we reconcile these two things?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, I was just reading a book review by Arthur Herman of a woman who had just written on exactly that issue. All right, the misunderstanding Americans have of the Chinese, that we should not assume that they're militaristic because we have so much exchange with them, and then that we should increase that exchange. And again, there's a significant truth to that. We have all sorts of companies here, like Google, who want to get into the Chinese market big time. All right, even if the state ends up restricting what we would call their First Amendment freedoms over there, Google would be happy to get involved. Various other companies want to set up shop in China. There are problems with the judicial system, with intellectual property and things like that. But that's very much the theme. And yet at the same time, as Herman points out in this book review, the Chinese are just arming to the teeth. Right? They spend more of their GDP, much more of their GDP as a percentage than we do, on military development. All right? They're building islands in the Spratlys. It's a long way from the Chinese coast, very close to Indonesia, Brunei, all these other countries in the South China Sea, and they're mortified. Right? The Chinese are setting up airstrips there. Right? They're going to be able to fly Sukhois and all sorts of other high-tech military technology off these islands. And they've got a navy and a naval base in South China that can project military power a long way. And yet there are trillions of dollars shipping through the South China Sea, as many of you know. It's one of the biggest trading routes in the world. And people like Herman are saying, look, we better be a little reticent here because they may be saying one thing on the one hand, but if you look at what they're actually doing, that seems to suggest something else. So it's very much, there's a tension, I think, even today between these things. All right, and who are the empires that we worry about the most? All right, they're not the poor states. All right, the most dynamic empires are the ones that are wealthy. Russia's having a problem because oil's gone through the floor in terms of its price. And the Russian economy is largely built on oil revenues. The Chinese are having the problems. I think the Chinese have a lot more problems than that. All right, if you go to China, if you go to Hong Kong, or you go up to Shenzhen, just north of there, or you go over to Macau, you take a ferry from Hong Kong over to Macau, a former Portuguese colony that has also been repatriated as of 1997 back to the Chinese. Or you got all these casinos right there on the waterfront. You can get off the ferry, you can walk, go to a casino, walk in 3 miles or even 2 miles, and you'll see extreme abject poverty at the west end of Macau. And then if you go further inland, there's extreme poverty. I think the Chinese have a lot of problems dealing with the extremes. There's a lot of money through the Pearl River Delta all the way up to Shanghai and Beijing. Lots and lots of dollars there. Once you get inland, there's a lot of poverty. Third world and worse types of poverty. And the Chinese government's going to have to reconcile this disparity in a very, very large country where the overwhelming majority are still very poor. So I don't think it's a real simple proposition, but it clearly raises exactly that issue about the nature of commerce, the nature of enterprise. But the theme in a lot of the stuff that I do is that, the idea that commerce has this sort of pacifying effect or this moderating effect is only a half-truth. It can in the right circumstance, but in other circumstances it can be a source of much aggression. All right? Party on? Is there a party or something going on back here?
Well, there is cake.
Are there any hockey games on the big screen?
I don't know.
I was so excited last night, I can't tell you. I was walking down, I even texted my wife, I'm at a brew pub in downtown Midland, and the USA-Finland game is on. She didn't text me back, I don't know what that means. Probably that I overstate the case, but I saw a guy with a Red Wings cap walking down the rail trail today, and we don't get any hockey in Utah, so Michigan's, a hockey state, so I'm excited. I'm only here till tomorrow morning, but I'm going to make the most of it.
I can't promise everybody's going to a hockey game, but anyway. So again, if you want to know more about the semester's programs, talk to me or about IHS. Professor Peacock will be around to take any questions you have for him individually. Again, we have refreshments. You're welcome to join us for that. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you on the 11th for our program at 4:30.
Thank you.